Symposium. We are honored to have with us today our chief guest, Mr. Mohammad Najibur Rahman, the former Principal Secretary to the Honorable Prime Minister and the Chairman of the Bangladesh Capital Market Stabilization Fund, the distinguished keynote presenter, Dr. M.A. Baki Khalili, the Professor and Dean, Department of Business Administration, University of the Asia Pacific, Mr. Muhammad Arfan Ali, President and Managing Director of Bank Asia, Mr. Nasiruddin Ahmed, the first Vice President of the Bangladesh Insurance Association and the Vice Chairman of the Meghna Life Insurance Company Limited, distinguished business leaders, friends from the print and electronic media, ladies and gentlemen. Once again, good afternoon to all of you. I would like to welcome you all to the parallel session of Risk Financing Strategy of the National Symposium on Private Sector Participation and Leadership in Disaster Risk Management, which is organized by Dhaka Chamber, ActionAid, World Vision, Bangladesh, European Union, and United Purpose, Bangladesh. We're indeed thankful to the chief guest and all the esteemed panelists, despite their busy schedule, for gracing the occasion. As you know, the Dhaka Chamber is the country's most vibrant voice of the SMEs, a family of 4,500 plus SMEs, and diverse business members, which has been putting forward fact-based opinions and, of course, prudent policy guidance for improving the continuous trade and investment development over the last 6 decades, addressing the needs of today's business and the economy of tomorrow. So from that perspective, Dhaka Chamber has been working in tandem with the public sector and development agencies on various contemporary issues, economic matters and such, where you know that our economy has marked 6% plus average growth in the past decade, outshining many regional economies, underpinned by the dynamic private sector, which the Honorable Prime Minister always says that 82 to 85% of the country's economic growth driver is the resilient private sector. That is also our sincere thanks to the macroeconomic management of the government with policy incentives and supports. So, from that perspective, brings us to disaster, which has adverse impacts with cascading effects on various spheres of social and economic development. Predominantly, you know that Bangladesh is exposed to wide-ranging disaster, holding back our economic expedition. So, of late, you know that the severity and frequency of natural disasters has risen, primarily owing to the climate change. And you have seen that there has been nearly a calculation of $15 billion worth of economic losses in Bangladesh just from disaster alone. And extreme natural disasters, as I said, is something we have experienced over the last 2.5 decades. The private sector is, as I said, considered the lifeline of the economy due to its relentless efforts in employment generation. But at the same time, they bear the brunt of disasters impacts in terms of damage and losses almost everywhere in the world, as evidenced in recent disasters regions, including the Pekin tsunami of India in 2004. We've had the earthquake in Japan in 2004, Nepal earthquake, which shattered their economy in 2015. And then we have the cyclone Amphan of 2020. However, Bangladesh has come a long way in minimizing the maximum risk. And of course, the government has also endorsed the Sendai framework of 2015 to 2030, which interestingly the then Principal Secretary to the Honorable Prime Minister himself has been working on. So thanks to you, Honorable Chief Guest. And this is primarily for the interest of both the private sector and the economy, considering the impact and the management of disasters. So from that perspective, I believe that this is something we need to make the private sector aware. We have to give them the policy perspective, the policy incentives, and of course, tax breaks. As you know that if we talk about 2 decades ago, we never thought our resilient private sector will be making unlimited investments in sustainability. But today, sustainability is not only a buzzword, it is a top priority for the largest foreign exchange earning sector of this country, which is ready-made garments. They do not even wish to start a business before going green. And that is the impact. How has it been possible in this country? Through policy support, through tax breaks, among many others. Now, Bangladesh Bank offers refinancing schemes for green products and buildings at a reduced rate, which does not compensate the industries. Therefore, we must, on the way forward, find some institutional financing approaches to be mainstream for the best interest of sustainable development of the private sector. Similarly, when it comes to disaster financing, that should also be done. And I would also ask the regulators. Unfortunately, one of our representatives from Bangladesh Bank, the general manager, is stuck in traffic. He will be joining us. I will bring him into the discussion much later. And of course, like I said, we need to urge the financial sector to improve catastrophe risk model with the help of private sector for easing risk assessment and financing process. So of course, before wrapping up, this is just to give you a tone of the dialogue now. And I would like to thank all the esteemed guests on the panel, as well as all of you who have been here since the very early morning today. I thank you for your patient hearing and joining the occasion. And I believe the valued remarks of all the panelists. And if time permits, we may also open the floor with the permission of the chief guest, that the recommendations of the participants will enlighten us and help us. This super consortium that you know, that the ECHO, ActionAid, Dhaka Chamber, United Purpose, and World Vision, the consortium will create an outcome paper and place it to the respective authorities on how we should proceed and be the example to the private sector that this consortium is taken for the first time, actually the first time in South Asia, not only in Bangladesh. And we hope that through this initiative of the super consortium breaking the ice, many other private sector initiators will also take this process. So I thank you all once again for your patient hearing. And without further ado, I will now move into the role of the moderator, and then eventually we will hear from our today's chief guest for the event. I thank you all for your patient hearing. Thank you. So at this point of time, we will request the distinguished professor, Dr. M.A. Baki Khalili, the professor and dean of the University of Asia Pacific, to deliver his keynote address and to create a flow for the discussion of today's session. Dr. M.A. Baki Khalili, ladies and gentlemen.
Take us. Okay. Right. Yes. Okay, you got my introduction, and I was also a professor at the Department of Finance, University of Dhaka. So after retiring from the University of Dhaka, then I was heading a research institute called Institute of Microfinance. And now after that, I'm now with the University of Asia Pacific. And Mr. Chairperson, Chief Guest, and distinguished panelists, and distinguished participants, good afternoon. I'll try to be brief, although there are some 33 slides, but I have been allocated a time of 20 minutes. So even going through the slides will take more. So let me just move on. This is the content that we will be discussing, not focusing so much on in what sequence I'll be discussing. So the critical issue, why we are discussing this thing, just I would like to introduce, it has been introduced already by the president of DCCI, and we have heard in the morning session. So Bangladesh is one of the most vulnerable countries to natural disasters in the world. This is well known, and it is the seventh countries in the world that is prone to a disaster. And this economic loss, the estimates that we find from 2016 to 20, that it ranges from 0.8 to some 1.1% of GDP. And it is increasing, and this estimation, even during this 2007, 2009, when Sidor and Ayla struck this country, this economic loss from those disasters were much higher in intensity. So one of the important part is how to finance. There are two ways to go about it. One, that you adopt some preventive measures so that your intensity of economic loss from disaster is minimum. And second approach is that you make provision for financing this economic loss, disaster arising from disaster. So we'll be basically talking about, today I'll be talking about this disaster risk financing with particular reference to Bangladesh. Two concepts that we need to separate, differentiate. One that was critically traditional, previously we used to know, disaster risk reduction. This refers to probability of reducing loss and damage to any disaster through preventive or mitigation and preparedness of possible impacts. Disaster risk management, which is now the buzzword and globally accepted, is much broader because it tells you about the approach to managing the disaster. So it brings the management perspective to this concept of disaster risk management. Therefore, DRM includes all management perspective, including financial management. We will be focusing on. So what are the pillars? Since this constitutes this management perspectives, there are some processes. So 5 pillars of disaster risk management, because we need to understand this. So first pillar is risk identification, for which you need quite extensive set of data. Risk reduction, what is strategies you can adopt to avoid creation of new risk. Third is preparedness, that improve capacity that I just mentioned. And then fourth pillar is financial protection. That financial protection is first, it is resilience of the households and firms against disaster and through financial protection. And finally, the last pillar that I mentioned, it is the post-disaster financing of loss and damages. So we have already mentioned that why disaster risk financing is important. As we mentioned that you need to, first it is part of the ARM. Second, that you need to have proper financial planning against loss and damage. Just you cannot solve this problem or address this intensity of loss and damage that we normally face without any financial planning. So it is critical in disaster risk financing, financial management, that financial plan takes place against this loss and damage. Secondly, disaster affects your livelihood and asset losses. It's both for the households and farms. Therefore, DRM aims at protecting livelihood and development, and second, increasing the financial resilience by implementing sustainable and cost-effective policies and operations. What are these principles? Before I talk about this, we need to first, that funding must be available timely. Whenever you need it, it must be available. Second thing, this is true given the intensity of loss and damages that caused by disaster. No single instrument or intervention can appear to be sufficient. Third principle is sources of risk finance and distribution of fund are equally important. So on the one hand, you need to mobilize resources, but on the other hand, you have to ensure that this fund is distributed to the beneficiaries, the disaster-affected households and farms. Therefore, one important principle is access to information is important for sound financial decision. That we have heard from the previous session, from the inaugural session. So what are the risk financing instruments? One is market-based instruments, generally that takes place, risk transfer, capacity building, etc. And This risk transfer is basically transferring your potential risks to the insurance companies. And so that is one, and one must develop the capability to cope with shock through improving access to finance and technology. Second type of instrument is contingency financing, that after a shock that there must be liquidity, a financial instrument that will provide liquidity immediately after the shock. Third is budgetary instrument, which is common in our country and almost not every developed countries, that budgetary allocation is made for facing disaster consequences. Bangladesh exposure to shock, ADB in 2016 estimated economic loss of $10.8 billion over the period 2000-2013. $10.8 billion. And CEDAR alone in 2000, CEDAR alone contributed to 1.7 billion. ILA contributed to some with a minimum consequence of $269 million. So over this time, government of Bangladesh has adopted a strategy consequences of cyclone that we faced in 1970. That intensity of loss and damage to property and life, we cannot conceive of that intensity today in 2020-22 because of the strategies adopted by the government, including the emergency shelter house and flow of information. And at the same time now, loss of livestock is also quite minimal because it now allows during the cyclone, the households are allowed to take their livestock to the shelter houses. Then I with my colleagues in 2017 did a study on the consequences of CEDAR and ILA, and we visited that. So I just mentioned that $10.8 billion was economic loss during the period 2000-2013. How is it financed? The same study of ADB Ojaki 2016, you can see that basically funding for recovery and rehabilitation, humanitarian aid, and foreign aid for emergency. So from 2006 to 2010, during this during that period, as I mentioned, two major disasters took place in Bangladesh, CEDAR and ILA, and that is why, particularly CEDAR, that is why you find a very peak in flow of foreign aid for emergency responses. But overall, there is a very low level of funding for recovery and so what is the funding sufficient, the one that we showed in the previous graph? No. Economic loss in 2013 was $10.79 billion. Total funding was $2.67 billion. So there is a funding gap of $8.12 billion. So that is a huge, it's roughly 80% of the economic loss that remain unfunded. So basically our approach to this financing disaster has been more limited to post-disaster emergency funding and limited rehabilitation. And the same evidence we found in our study in 2017, that was a national level study. So of the poor households, what we found, that average loss was 30,000 taka for poor households, and including 15,000 loss for houses, property. And we visited these households after 10 years. I'm just trying to make the point, I'm just trying to complement the findings from ADB study 2016, that we visited the households after almost 10 years. What we found, only 28% of CEDAR affected households could go back to pre-disaster state. Only 28, and 15% could not recover at all at 10 years after CEDAR. So that is, and the same thing with the lesser intensity. In case of ILA, 37% could fully recover to the pre-disaster level, and 23% could not do. So you can understand from the simple statistics, in case of 72%, CEDAR, 72% could partly or not at all cope with this loss and damages. And in case of CEDAR, it was also, it was like 60%, 62%. So that tells me about the need for disaster financing, that how severe the situation is. So now the challenges, before I talk about the challenges and funding, so let us first take the disaster. What is the disaster risk ecosystem in Bangladesh? We have got government of Bangladesh that provides budgetary allocation, has created disaster trust fund, climate trust fund, climate resilience fund, green fund, and so on. That is the role of the government. Insurance companies, though limited in this case, but still that is a part of that, and one of the important stakeholders and players in the disaster risk management in Bangladesh. Third is PKSF and microfinance institutions. They are major players, particularly financing these poor households and small enterprises affected by disaster. And these institutions are not only supporting in post-disaster, but also in pre-disaster. So that is they are, and the regulators is another, that is in IDRA, Bangladesh Bank, and BSEC, Securities and Exchange Commissions. They also contribute to the process of formulating policies and binding the policies for the fourth is banks. Banks, particularly Bangladesh Bank has formulated policy for banks to support sustainable and green finance to reduce effects of climate change. And I know that these banks have been playing a critical role. And this financing sustainable and providing sustainable and green funds, it is basically pre-disaster resilience approach to potential loss and damages. I must, however, say here that our study in 2017 showed us that the poor households that had access to microcredit or bank credit had the higher coping abilities. So they build more resilience. So that is why access to finance appears to be very important strategy. Now, what are the constraints? As I showed you, the evidence from ADB that there is, despite the efforts from the government of Bangladesh and other stakeholders, funding gap still exists. That is. Second thing, that transfer of risk is a major solution, one of the major solutions, and that we find from evidences from developed and other developing countries. But in Bangladesh, insurance penetration is low. Therefore, the effectiveness of insurance in disaster risk management, financing loss and damages becomes limited, but that is a constraint. Third is limited private-public collaboration in disaster management. The chief guest was telling me while sitting there that he remarked that disaster is no longer a public sector, public goods, it is equally private goods, and this is not a public sector buzzword, this has become the buzzword for the whole nation. True, and I'm so happy to see that the CCI has been taking this leadership and initiative in discourse on disaster risk management. So financing, let me come down to this financing issue. First thing that I have already mentioned, that you need to optimize risk financing. So two ways you can do it. One, that you minimize the exposure to loss and damage. Second, you increase the resilience of the households, community, firms. So building that financial resilience of institutions and government support to cope with loss and damage. So first two approach, that is related to minimizing exposure and increasing resilience, related to prevention of disaster risk. And second one, last one, is about post-disaster financial support to loss and damages. So strategies for minimizing risk. I'm almost at the end of my presentation. Some evidences suggest, as I just mentioned a little while ago, that access to finance in pre-disaster period increases resilience of the household. That is true for poor households as well as the firms in private sector. Second, evidence suggests, I'm talking about the evidences from developed and developing countries, from the literature that we find, that improving awareness is required. Awareness about the potential consequences of disaster is required. So that is important. Third, building the community infrastructure like economic institutions, roads, highways, etc., reduces intensity of loss and damages. One example is shelter house in our country, that reduces this. But important point that evidence suggests, in Spain, I can mention that in Spain, disaster risk insurance is compulsory. That is absolutely compulsory, but that is the kind of strategy is required for a country like, but we have to figure out how best we can do it. But transfer of risk to different institutions like insurance companies reduces economic pressures on affected households and firms. Then post-disaster financing strategies is quite simple, that you need to ensure flow of required fund for emergency aid and rehabilitation. All the efforts that government of Bangladesh over these past decades, even equally in other developing countries, that emergency aid and rehabilitation support was the major post-disaster financing strategies. It is equally true, but important point is, challenge is inadequacy is the challenge. So best practices for diverse financial instruments, budgetary allocation and national fund, development of disaster insurance market, the one that we mentioned that it is more or less absent, but it is well developed in European countries, even in Brazil. So we need to seriously think about developing the disaster insurance market in Bangladesh, particularly on the role of agriculture property insurance. Then transfer of cash to the affected vulnerable households, that is evidence, the part of the best practices we find. In Bangladesh also, very recently, during the Corona time, Bangladesh government also transferred cash to different poor households and supported the small and medium enterprises through their incentive-focused credit system. So financial inclusion, one of the, whatever be the things, but everybody, every firm should be brought under financial inclusion. Then debt instruments are also available that we find in different countries. I will talk about that, and private and public partnership in development of economic infrastructure. So these are the 6 best practices we find from the literature. So with strategies for financing disaster risk in Bangladesh, first thing is in preventive and preparedness strategies, that you increase disaster risk related environmental literacy. People need to know about the consequences of disaster, environment related disaster. So there has to be your environmental literacy, which has, over the past decade, it has quite been extensive, but still people, not all people in all over the country know about environmental literacy. So that is one we need to increase. Second is insurance literacy, that penetration of insurance penetration is limited because of insurance literacy. So that we need to increase so that households and firms can transfer risks to the insurance companies. Build private and public partnership in infrastructure and institutional development. This is also a very common practice globally, and I'm sure that private sector in this country can collaborate with government in building these institutions and infrastructure under different arrangement. Community level interventions for resilience can be accelerated through PKSF and microfinance institutions and other related organizations. Financing strategy, pool resources from, now I'm talking more about how to establish this, pool resources from private and public sector through, I'm just suggesting what it should be, through fiscal intervention like tax and budgetary allocation. We may call this fund a national disaster fund. The reason that I'm titling this I'm calling it National Disaster Fund because that draws the attention of the people. We have funds like Climate Resilience Fund, Green Fund, and so on, but that funds have exposure to only limited. So titling a fund as National Disaster Fund will draw the attention. And to ensure that individuals and private organizations contribute, the contribution may be tax exempted so that they are given this incentive to contribute, and then make provision for cash transfer and contingency credit to. The most challenging, the one just I mentioned in Spain, that disaster risk insurance is compulsory, and I would like to see that although Bangladesh has limited resources, insurance companies have limited resources, but through a partnership and the right strategies, something like subsidizing premium by the government, can make this disaster risk insurance possible in this country. And insurance product may be diversified. That may include climate risk insurance, crop insurance, livestock insurance, property insurance, and so on. And IDRA should take required steps to expand disaster-related insurance from the on the basis of national priority. Banks and Bangladesh Bank has been playing a very critical role. In 2011, if I am not wrong, they formulated a policy for financing, for sustainable finance and green finance, and that banks have been prudently implementing that policies, and I would expect that to continue at a larger scale. Government should support MFIs to provide financial support. During this corona time, government provided a fund to PKSF and NGOs under stimulus package. The one I was talking about, the private-public partnership, sovereign bond may be issued, which is a common practice in Western countries, in European countries, to finance these consequences loss. Sovereign bond may be issued with private and public partnership, and that must be guaranteed by insurance company. This is a possible, so a way forward, basically these strategies that I have just mentioned, that is what I see as way forward, you know. So what will be my last statement, that disaster risk management finance need to be sorted out mostly through the market mechanism and private-public partnership. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Khalili. That was indeed a very long and detailed presentation. I didn't bother interrupting you because this is going to help us have the subsequent moderation. So you already fed a lot of talking points to the panelists today. So let me just quickly move on. We have with us Mr. Nasiruddin, the Vice Chairman, Nasiruddin Ahmed, the first Vice President of the Bangladesh Insurance Association. I'll just pose a question, and then if you wish, you can speak from here, or you can go to the podium. Yes, sir. My question to you would be, you heard about this livestock insurance, climate risk insurance, crop insurance, you know. These are the products that are already used in various other countries, as we heard from the keynote. But how we can, you know, the disaster risk reduction, how insurance companies can play a vital role to engage the private sector to come into these kind of initiatives. Mr. Nasiruddin Ahmed is the Vice President of the Bangladesh Insurance Association and also the Vice Chairman of Magna Life Insurance Company Limited.
Honorable Chief Guest of today's session, MD Nazibur Rahman, Chairman, Capital Market Stabilization Fund, and very successful former NBR Chairman, and my fellow discussant with me, KM Millat, General Manager, Sustainable Finance Department, Bangladesh Bank, Mr. Mohammad Arfan Ali, President and Managing Director, Bank Asia, and today's moderator, very young President of DCCI, Mr. Rizwan Rahman. So I'll give my speech and my all the thing in very short way, and I'll make it in English and Bengali together, because I see here most of the people I will love to see in Bengali and English together. First, I want to tell one thing, that if you think Bangladesh population is number 8 in this world, that is officially 16 crore 14 lakh. If I compare Bangladesh with Samoa, it's a very small island, their population is 1,98,000. So if any earthquake happen in Bangladesh and Samoa in the same time with the magnitude of 7, so what will happen in Bangladesh and what will happen in Samoa? A lot of people will die in Bangladesh, and lot of property will be damaged. And Bangladesh is in a very risk on strong and moderate earthquake zone. Should we think of it? So, ভূমিকম্পের বিষয়টাকে আমাদের মাথায় নিতে হবে। যদিও ভূমিকম্প কিন্তু once in a century হয়, but it is very disastrous. আমাদের বিআইএ থেকে বারবার প্রস্তাব করা হয়েছিল যে সকল ভবন হাই রাইজ বিল্ডিং তাদের অন্তত ইন্স্যুরেন্সটা আর্থকোয়েক এবং ফায়ার করা হোক। ম্যান্ডেটরি তো এইসব ইন্স্যুরেন্স সব দেশে আছেই, বাট ম্যান্ডেটরি হোক অথবা ঐচ্ছিক হোক, এগুলোকে কভারের আওতায় আনতে হবে। আদারওয়াইজ যে পরিমাণ ক্ষয়ক্ষতি বাংলাদেশের হবে সেটা বাংলাদেশ গভর্নমেন্ট তার হয়তোবা 10%ও বিয়ার করতে পারবে না। Second point is this, I was talking with my fellow colleague just few minutes ago, যে আমাদের দেশে একসময় ফ্যাক্টরিগুলো যখন ইন্স্যুরেন্স করা হতো, দোকানপাট ইন্স্যুরেন্স করা হতো, দ্যাট টাইম ফায়ার ইন্স্যুরেন্সের সাথে কিন্তু ফ্লাড, সাইক্লোন ম্যান্ডেটরি নেওয়া হতো। বাট রিসেন্টলি ব্যাংকিং পলিসি ইজ দিস, এনি ফাইন্যান্সে শুধুমাত্র ফায়ার ইন্স্যুরেন্স কাভার করলেই চলবে। দ্যাট মিনস দ্য থিং ইজ দিস, ব্যবসায়ীরা স্বেচ্ছায় হয়তো ফ্লাড ইন্স্যুরেন্স নিতে পারে, সাইক্লোন, অথবা নাও নিতে পারে। বাট বাংলাদেশের মানুষের যে শিক্ষার হার, অথবা আমরা যেভাবে ইন্স্যুরেন্স কোম্পানি, আমি ফুললি এগ্রি উইথ ইউ, সেভাবে পেনিট্রেট হতে পারিনি। সেক্ষেত্রে আমার মনে হয় যে আমরা চিন্তা করতে পারি অন্তত ঝুঁকিপূর্ণ সাইক্লোন এবং ফ্লাড এরিয়াগুলোতে যেন যদি ব্যাংক ফাইন্যান্সিং থাকে তাহলে ফ্লাড এবং সাইক্লোন বাধ্যতামূলক করা হয়। অ্যানাদার থিং ইজ দিস, আমি কয়েকটা পয়েন্ট বলি আমার বক্তব্য শেষ করব। মোস্ট অফ দ্য কেসেস ইন বাংলাদেশ, লাস্ট কয়েকটা ডিজাস্টারে দেখা গেছে যে মানুষের মৃত্যু কম হয়েছে, বাট সম্পদের যে ক্ষয়ক্ষতি সেটা ঠেকানো যায় না, স্পেশালি দ্য প্রপার্টি ড্যামেজ। সো এই সাধারণ প্রান্তিক মানুষগুলোর যখন ঘর ভেঙে যায়, রিসেন্টলি আমরা টিভিতেও দেখেছি যে রিভার স্লাইডিংয়ের কারণে মানে বিল্ডিং ভেঙে যাচ্ছে। সো দ্যাট ইজ দ্যাট ওয়াজ নট ইনশিওর্ড। সো মাই সাজেশন ইজ দিস, ওই দোজ প্রপার্টিগুলোতে ইন্স্যুরেন্স কোম্পানিগুলো আমরা আরও এগিয়ে আসতে হবে, অ্যাওয়ারনেস বিল্ড আপ করতে হবে, ম্যান্ডেটরি হোক আর নাই হোক সেগুলোকে ইন্স্যুরেন্সের আওতায় নিয়ে আসতে হবে। এগ্রিকালচার ইন্স্যুরেন্স অলরেডি উই স্টার্টেড, সাধুমিয়া কর্পোরেশন সহ ফিউ কোম্পানিজ ইন বাংলাদেশ উই অলরেডি স্টার্টেড, এবং সাম এরিয়াতে এটার সুবিধা মানুষ, কৃষকরা পাচ্ছে। বাট দ্য ডিফারেন্স ইজ দিস ইন বাংলাদেশ অ্যান্ড পার্শ্ববর্তী দেশ ইন্ডিয়াতে, যেটা হলো they have a separate agricultural insurance company in national level. Yearly premium income is 73 million US dollar. So that is profitable there. But আমাদের এখানে যেহেতু আমরা low scale করছি, so it's very difficult to make profit. So we need government subsidy initially, but after some time, because insurance theory, sir bhalo aছেন, bhalo bolte parben, if you insure only Sonarga hotel, the premium will be high. If you insure a 5-star hotel in Dhaka city, it will be much lower to all 10. So if you cannot increase the number of coverage, we cannot reduce the premium, we cannot reduce our losses. One example I want to say is very important for us. That is what happened in Asia 2011 in Thailand. That was the biggest loss we faced in this region. That was a huge flood loss that is equivalent to 18 billion US dollar. And the most of the losses is paid by European reinsurance companies. So if we take covers and reinsure with as a catastrophic insurance to foreign reinsurer, we can get easily out of this financial risk management issue. I will fully agree with Sir Bakibullah Sir, Baki Khalili Sir. I know him also before. Some areas I fully agree with you. Most of the areas, and it was a detailed presentation yesterday night. I see this, I totally read this. I'll make it very short in very few minutes. My some proposal not related to insurance. One is this, regarding today's, we see taken by very amazing step by DCCI. This is the first emergency center, private sector in Southeast Asia. My suggestion is, please, if possible, tag this center to our regulatory office, IDRA. Make a connection with us through IDRA so that our regulator can know what is happening here, and also insurance company will know through IDRA what they should have to do. Another suggestion is this. It's very difficult one. Maybe is maybe my overthinking. Can we raise a fund for our future climate risk in private sector? But because what we see when any calamity happen, we go to the PM office and give checks. But can we make a fund for private sector before the calamity happen? This is one thing, is maybe I'm overthinking. Another thing is that is called all over the world is also disaster, but we don't mention here. That is a big terrorist attack or any riot happen in a country, because we are very close to some areas in these issues. So we should also think, if any big terrorist attack happen and riot happen in this region, what should we do? Insurance company has to go a long way. I fully agree with you. We need more climate related product, especially what happened recently. I'm telling you one example. Few insurance company develop a product for mango, because mango is a good fruit for our country. Also sometimes we export. So for mango, we develop a product for insurance. In India, there is an insurance for potato, for rubber, and this way. So we have to think different innovative ways. So another thing I just not want to miss, that is usually সাধারণত আমরা যখন দেখি যে কোনো উপকূলে সতর্কবার্তা হয়, তখন যে নৌযানগুলো থাকে বা মাছ ধরার ট্রলারগুলো থাকে, সেগুলো কিন্তু ইন্স্যুরেন্স করা থাকে না। তো আমাদেরকে ওদিকেও চিন্তা করতে হবে, কারণ হয়তো ওই মানুষটার জন্য ওই ট্রলারটুকুই তার সম্বল। আমাদের দেশে পাটুরিয়াতে এই বিয়ে থেকেও মানুষ গাড়ি বোধহয় ফেরি থেকে পড়েও ইন্স্যুরেন্স করা ছিল না, সো সেখানে ক্ষতিগ্রস্ত হয়েছে। সো উই হ্যাভ টু মোর অ্যাডভার্টাইজ, more awareness build up, and we have to make it in a way that the whole country, whole nation and government should get help from insurance. I think I have touched few points. It's a very small session. In future, if I have any chances to talk, I'll prepare more for that. And I also again thanking DCCI, also our very young and energetic president. He has taken a remarkable step today. I don't know what the future of this step, but I know this step is a big step today. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for your vote of confidence in Dhaka Chamber. This is not a big step, it is not a small step, but it is the first step to many other steps that the private sector will take in the future. At this point of time, we have with us a very seasoned banker among us. We have with us Mr. Muhammad Arfan Ali, the President and Managing Director of Bank Asia Limited, who of course, needless to mention, is having a vast experience in the banking sector. And I would like to humbly request you to share your views on diverse range on the financing that is required for a sustainable disaster management. And also how a suitable banking-led strategy, financing-led strategy can be followed.
Thank you, dear moderator, Mr. Rizwan Rahman. Assalamu alaikum and very good afternoon. Today's chief guest, Mr. Mohammad Najibur Rahman, Chairman, Capital Market Stabilization Fund, and former Principal Secretary to the government and Chairman of NBR. Today's keynote speaker, Mr. M.A. Baki Kholili, Professor and Dean, Department of Business Administration, University of Asia Pacific, and he also chairs the Risk Management Committee of Bank Asia. Mr. K.M. Millard, General Manager, Sustainable Finance Department, as a panelist, and we have also with us Mr. Nasiruddin Ahmed Pavel, first Vice President of Bangladesh Insurance Association and Vice Chairman, Meghna Life Insurance Limited, distinguished guests. When we talk about financing and financial inclusion, we talk about building resilience as well. As a bank, the private sector, especially private sector bank, generally the concentration is in the urban areas, and we talk about big business. We talk about financing big corporates. But to the context of this country, especially when we learn from the paper presenter that we are the 7th riskiest country in the world in terms of disaster, natural disaster, rising sea, and other disasters like earthquake, cyclones. It is very important to take a preparation, and one of the steps, 5 steps, 2 steps relates to banking services. So building resilience through bank account is very important. So we need to give those people living in the rural areas, to the vulnerable areas, the bank account they need to save money and to transfer money in terms of when they face the disaster, when they face some of the calamities in their life. So there are 2 parts here. First, pre-financing. We do not wait for that some disaster will happen and we will give money to them. It should be a precondition that we give the bank account to them so they can manage their finance themselves, they can build resilience by themselves, as well as the banks, financial institution, government can help them to get advanced in financial literacy, financial management. Then second step comes about the financial transfer and a special credit transfer when it is required after the disaster happens. In Bangladesh, as we know, 50% of the population still do not have bank account. And in the rural areas, it is 70%. We pioneered agent banking in this country to include those people, vulnerable people, in the rural areas, all over Bangladesh. And now 29 banks are working. And this model has proved very efficient for including the marginal and unbanked people to the banking system. We have operation in Sundarbans, we have operation in Satkhira, we have operations in remote areas, chor areas of the country. So financial inclusion is, as we call that, it is the 6th fundamental right. Without money, without having good access to credit, we cannot do anything sustainable. As people become poorer, they become vulnerable. It is not the problem of the people concerned. It is the problem of the system. It is the problem of the bankers. It is the problem of the government that we are not doing enough for the people in the marginal level. So it is our duty to go ahead with the agenda of financial inclusion, as government also advancing with the national financial inclusion strategy, where by 2026, every citizen of the country will have a bank account. That is very important development happening here at this moment. We have also some experience with disaster funding. We worked with German Red Crescent Society in the Hatia Deep, where we transferred money to the people who were affected by the cyclones. We have experience with UNDP. We transferred money to the marginal people during COVID. We have experience with Rohingya people. We have transferred money to the homeless people who migrated from Burma. So the private sector engagement, especially the banks, it is possible to make it more effective and let all the banks come together for this rescue. Private-public partnership is very important. I always mention the high ex-government official and now also in a very important job he is there. The mistrust and distrust between the government and private sector is the major thing that hinders the progress and building partnership. We as a private operator always feel that we cannot earn enough trust from the government that we can also do something better. We can do many things that can resolve the issue of the society. In today's world, no business will survive until it explains that the very existence of this business is to solve some problem, to do some betterment of the society. The market will force us to do that. The government needs to create that environment that the equal level playing field is there and the institutions in the private level can play the role as well. So in banking service, we are happy that 61 banks are working together for the development of this country. And we believe this competitive market will force the banks to behave properly and rightly. Otherwise, they cannot survive in this competitive market. And as there are some proposals from one panel discussion that we can create disaster management fund. As banks are also donating money for different charitable purpose, sustainable works, yes, there can be some fund, emergency fund, that can help the people in the coastal areas, people in the vulnerable areas to get access to this fund at a lower cost, lower interest rate, so they can build their future. Basically, giving money to somebody will not solve the problem. Financial literacy and making them able is very important. As we have worked long 30 years, especially I myself have a career of 31 years in banking, we understand that making somebody resilient by teaching them financial literacy, making them financially literate, making them responsible user of financial services can be better rewarding than giving money to somebody. So we can work together for the better society, for the better future, as we see from the paper that 37% of the affected people never come to the same life again. I mean, the suffering is prolonged. One economist was telling that the crisis, the price hike is not the problem. The problem is, do you have money to buy it? Are you able to, your purchasing power is very important. So if we can create that power, that can resolve the most problems we face today. So as a bank, as a part of the financial system, we can commit that we'll work together with the government, with different organizations as we work past, that we can build a more resilient society for future. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I truly believe that private sector friendly strategic financing policies will definitely urge the private sector to come forward. You'd rightly said when supporting financially will not only solve the problems of disaster, because money doesn't stop a disaster. It is rather the disaster readiness of the private sector as well as the public sector, which we have seen during our Rana Plaza tragedy. We had a lot of resources, a lot of money, but not enough resources to actually stop the situation from getting worse. We did not take the proper initiatives. We have seen this during this, the fire in the Bashundhara shopping mall, where our fire brigade was not able to go above the 12th story. But the other day, we did a test run from the same private sector emergency operations center in front of the minister, where we brought in these, the electromechanic ladders, which can go up to 24 or 26 stories. And 20 more of these machines have been brought by the government. So again, government is taking the initiative at the same time, the private sector, which is, I repeatedly say, 85% contributor to the national growth, they should also take their initiatives. So thank you, Mr. Afan Ali, for your valuable suggestions. And just for the information of our guests and of course our chief guest and the respective panelists, that every time we have a discussion like this, we actually eventually form an outcome report. We place it to the chief guest as well as the respective policymakers, all the persons concerned, whether it is the Ministry of Finance, whether it is the Ministry of any other Ministry of Commerce, or even the Ministry of Disaster Management and Relief. So at this point, we would like to hear from the private sector. I'm very happy actually, because I was slightly worried that our General Manager of the Sustainable Finance Department of Bangladesh Bank, he wasn't able to join us because he had a very important meeting at the Bangladesh Bank. But however, he made his effort. He managed to show up in time right before his speech. So thank you, sir, for joining us despite your busy schedule. Now, I have solely one question to you. It's just how can Bangladesh Bank work in institutionalizing this financing in disaster risk? You know, at the end of the day, private sector will do its part, but how is Bangladesh Bank going to institutionalize it? And the only reason we say it is because for further private sector involvement in these kind of disaster risk management. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. K.M. Milad, General Manager, Bangladesh Bank.
Thank you, Honorable Moderator, Chair, today's Honorable Chief Guest of this event, the keynote speaker, panel discussants, and in front, my colleagues, my friends, and ladies and gentlemen, a very good afternoon to you all. In fact, Bangladesh Bank, the Central Bank of Bangladesh, has been so passionate since 2008 onwards, because once you see the mainstreaming corporate social responsibility activities, that's very circular was issued in the year 2008, and the corporate social responsibility activities for the banks and financial institutions to address the distressed, helpless, community investment, the disaster management. And the moderator, the chair, he was talking about the Rana Plaza disaster. You see, once the Rana Plaza, it's a 6 or 7 story building, and you see that there had been credit risk assessment. That was very much there. And if you look at the 4th or 5th floor, the garments or textile, whatever it was there, all the credit risk assessment has been assessed. But still, the environmental and social risk assessment from that perspectives were not addressed. You see that credit risk management, the risk management means the workforce, the management competence, the supply risk, the what is there, the building, everything was fine. But the building code, there is a problem in the building. So it was not addressed. So when it collapsed, and also the disaster came out that the topmost authority said that if you don't work for the day, it was a symbol that was alarming that it might fall down. It could be a real disaster. But it was said that the labor force has to work all the day, otherwise they will not going to have their wages. So that was the very mindset of the topmost authority. So once we talk about disaster management, once we talk about green management, the leadership should be a green one. It should be green governance. The leadership is very important. Once we see our Honorable Prime Minister, he is green-minded, inclination is there. Our governor, Honorable Governor, Minister of Finance. But once we see that the green governance of the banking industry, all the banks are not going in the same pace. Where the board management are very much inclined, their middle layer and lower management are very comfortable to run with, to fight with, to go with the green banking policy and the disaster management. Bangladesh Bank, since 2011, a policy guidelines for green banking, it was issued for the banks and financial institutions. Then thereafter, environmental risk management, it came out on 30th January 2011. Then a very comprehensive environmental and social risk management that was issued in the year December 2017. And all the banks and financial institutions they have the mandatory agenda to go with that. What is the benefit of that? That is the asset, that is the portfolio disbursement is not that much important. Yes, the banks are ready to increase their assets. But most importantly, whether those assets are quality assets or not over the period of time. You see, the loans, the industry average of the asset quality of banks and financial institutions is around 8 to 9% or like that. But once you see the assets, those went through environmental and social due diligence. I'm talking about the 6 years statistics, it is below 1%. The non-performing loan status is below 1%. When the loans went through environmental and social, I'm talking about the last 6 years. Then if we talk about the green products, projects, initiatives, loans, those went through ESDD. The percentage is very negligible. It is 0.2%. So environmental, social, and governance, due diligence, it is very, very important, and now banks are much more motivated to go with that. Actually, when we talk about access to finance, we see that what is the major problem in the banks and financial institutions to avail the finance? Access to finance is a major problem. I am not agreed to accept that, because access to finance is not a major problem. The major problem is the mindset. The major problem is the very attitude. The major problem is the most communication, information gap. We have so many things in the supply side, and even we don't know how to utilize the 50% of those supply things are there, because we are not aware of those things. So communication gap, information gap is a major challenge. Then also green governance, the leadership, that is also a major problem. Like Ministry of Finance, Ministry of Industry, then Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change, then Bangladesh Bank, Bangladesh Securities Exchange Commission, IDRA, and certainly banks and financial institutions, they are the players. So everybody has to be under the same umbrella to contribute in such a manner that it should be a all-round cricket, it should be a total football approach. In that case, there will be no communication information gap, and the access to finance will then never be realized as a major problem. That is one. Then in sort of communication, there should be MIS. That should be a dedicated database for the potential clients, for the manufacturers, respective manufacturers, suppliers, service providers, and then banks and financial institutions will be among them to bridging the supply and demand side blending. There should be an investment of the blended investment, like it should be the public-private investment. When you talk about the sustainable finance policy, that has been already said that in December 2020, we have a sustainable finance policy where sustainable taxonomy, green taxonomy is much more detailed in the Bangladesh Bank Sustainable Finance Policy than the European Union they have issued. It's much more detailed and strengthened. Then when you see the sustainable finance policy, it is very much unique on the globe. So what I'm telling about that because they are the greening the polluting industries. Not only the greening the mine, but greening the polluting industries. Once you see the traditional fixed chimney kilns, those are now stopped forcibly. But you see the tunnel kiln, most environment friendly. You see the hybrid Hoffman kiln, less environment friendly. But once you see the policy of the two institutions, like the Department of Environment under the Forest Environment Climate Change, they are saying that no burned bricks will move on after 2025. So that is the DOE Progapon. But once you see the Ministry of Industry, under the same country, another ministry said that Ministry of Industry has declared tunnel clean and hybrid Hoffman clean as industry. So what will bank do? Bank will finance for 8 to 10 years. So it will go up to 2030. And tunnel clean is burn brick, but most environment friendly. All the fumes are being absorbed within the very system. So once it is there, it is the bankable project. And it will run up to 2030. But when the policy is there that no burn brick will run on after 2025, again the Minister of Industry said that these are the two products belong to industry. Then what will banks do? What will the investors do? So these are the policy intervention. These policies need to be green. So green policy intervention for the sustainability of the green projects, initiatives. As many as there are 68 green projects, initiatives belong to 11 green categories that you can find in the sustainable finance policy. And also there is talk about green bond. When you talk about green bond for the capital market infrastructure development, then the Bangladesh Securities Exchange Commission, Bangladesh Bank, other ministries, all the ministries, they need to be under the same umbrella. So what Bangladesh Bank is thinking, there is the advisory committee, that is for the policy, green finance taxonomy policy for green bond. It's being under preparation, sir. So it is under the chair, and hopefully within the July there will be a green bond, a green finance taxonomy for green bond for the banks and financial institutions, at least to some extent, banks and financial institutions of the Bangladesh Securities Exchange Commission. So what I will tell about the communication gap, information gap is the major problem. Green governance, there should be adequate green governance. The capacity building should be A to Z for all the concerned personalities, and also there should be collaboration among all the concerned stakes that is badly required. When we talk about finance, then we would say that finance, this is not a sufficient condition. Is it a sustainable finance? Still we can say that is a sufficient condition met up. Then if we say that it is green finance, still it's not a sufficient condition. If we talk about inclusive green finance, yes, it is there, but the asset inclusion and the NFIs, I would say that the people under this umbrella, they are very much vulnerable. So when you talk about the seashore people, we should see that there is a sandwich panel. There is a low-cost funding arrangement of Bangladesh Bank, where where the sandwich panels are there. So those vulnerable peoples can rid of their disaster if they can go with these sandwich panels. If we talk about green building, it is for the corporates. It is for the rich people. If we talk about the green industry, to some extent, it is being addressed for the inclusive green finance. But when we talk about the green housing, it's a 30-story building, sir. And in all the buildings, there could be 20, 30 units. So if it is there, then it can address the lower and middle class group. At the one time, it is environment friendly. At the other side, it is inclusive, and it is the green inclusive finance for this. So there is many more talk, and it will kill the very time, and we are not in such a forum that I can talk about next 7 days. So it's not possible. So I would stop here. I wish all the very best. I see that the mindset is important, and the collaborative and cooperative coordination is much more required, and certainly we are the victim of circumstances. So both nationally and internationally, coordination, cooperation is badly required. So we should live not only for ourselves, we should live for others. So go green, live green, and live for others. Thank you very much for giving me a very, very patient hearing. Thank you all.
Thank you, Mr. K. Milad. In fact, it was almost like another keynote to understand the strategies behind Bangladesh Bank trying to promote policy-friendly support. But as you rightly mentioned, that there is a lot of intervention required from the government itself, like the Minister of Industries and so on. So definitely, before we reach out to them regarding this outcome paper that I just mentioned to you, we will show you a draft of our proposals, and just to make sure that both the Bangladesh Bank's voice as well as the private sector's requirements are heard. So before moving on to our chief guest, I would like to open the floor briefly with the permission of the chair, with the chief guest. If আপনাদের কারো যদি কোনো ধরনের প্রশ্ন থাকে, আমি আসলে আজকে একটা কথা স্বীকার করি, আমি আজকে 1.5 বছর ধরে এই দায়িত্ব পালন করার পরে আজকে এই মিটিংয়ে বসে প্রতিটা জিনিসে আমি নতুন করে শিখলাম। মানে এটা কিন্তু আসলে বাস্তবতা, আমাদের প্রাইভেট সেক্টরে কিন্তু অনেক অ্যাওয়ারনেস নাই এই ব্যাপারে, এটা সত্য কথা, এটা মানে লজ্জার কিছু নয়, এটা অস্বীকার করার কিছু নয়। আমি আজকে অনেক কিছু শিখলাম, জানলাম, এখানে আমি নিজেই শিখলাম, আমি মডারেটর, আমি নিজেই জানি না অনেক কিছু। আজকে প্রেজেন্টেশন থেকে এক ধরনের কথা আসতো, আমাদের ফাইন্যান্সিয়াল সেক্টর থেকে আরেক ধরনের কথা আসতো, আমাদের রেগুলেটর যে সেন্ট্রাল ব্যাংক যে তারা আমাদেরকে কিছু ধরনের কিছু রেকমেন্ডেশন দিলেন। সো আই উড লাইক টু ওপেন দ্য ফ্লোর। আপনাদের কারো যদি কোনো ধরনের কিছু জানার কিছু থাকে, আপনারা অবশ্যই ইউ ক্যান রেজ ইউর হ্যান্ডস অ্যান্ড মাইক উইল রিচ ইউ। আপনাদের কারো যদি বা কোনো এখানে যদি কোনো প্রশ্ন আপনাদের থাকে, ইজ দেয়ার এনিবডি অন দ্য ফ্লোর? একটু পরিচয়টা দিয়ে তারপরে আপনি বলেন।
আসসালামু আলাইকুম, আমি কাশ্মীর রেজা, আমি হাওর নিয়ে কাজ করি, হাওর অঞ্চল থেকে পরিবেশ ও হাওর উন্নয়ন সংস্থার আমি সভাপতি হিসেবে আছি। আজকের আয়োজনটা খুব প্রাসঙ্গিক, ধন্যবাদ জানাচ্ছি। যে বিষয়গুলো আমি একটু বলতে চাচ্ছি, যে আমরা একটু রিমোট এরিয়াতে কাজ করি, মনে করেন আমি সুনামগঞ্জের একটা হাওরের কাজ করি, যখন দেখা যায় যে ন্যাচারাল ক্যালামিটিস লাইক ফ্ল্যাশ ফ্লাড হয় নর্মালি হাওর এরিয়াতে, তো এই সিভিও যারা আছে তারা যে কর্পোরেট হাউসের সাথে বা গভর্নমেন্টের সাথে যে যোগাযোগ করা, সেইখানে আমার মনে হচ্ছে একটা গ্যাপ আছে, যেটা কমিউনিকেশন গ্যাপের কথা আমার আগের বক্তা যিনি বলে গেছেন। তো এই গ্যাপটা কিভাবে রিডিউস করা যায়। আরেকটা জিনিস আমি দেখি যে আমরা যে সময় এই ডিজাস্টারগুলো নিয়ে কথা বলি, তখন ওই যে হাওরের যে ডিজাস্টার, সেটা কেমন যেন আমার কাছে মনে হয়েছে যে প্রপারলি অ্যাড্রেস হয় না। যেমন আজকেও যে আলোচনা বা কিনোট স্পিকার আলোচনা খুব সমৃদ্ধ একটা বিষয় ছিল, কিন্তু 2017 সালে যে হাওড়ে ফ্ল্যাশ ফ্লাড হয়েছে, $400 মিলিয়ন চেয়েও বেশি ক্ষতি হয়েছিল। সো এরপরে এই যে 2000 সাল থেকে এখন 2022 সাল পর্যন্ত এই 22 বছরে হাওড়ে অন্তত 9 বার আমরা ফসলহানির সম্মুখীন হয়েছি। সো এ থেকে বের হয়ে আসার আমাদের একটা সাস্টেইনেবল সলিউশন বের করা দরকার, এবং হাওড়ে আমি মনে করি অল্টারনেটিভ সোর্স অফ আর্নিং দরকার। সো কীভাবে এই গ্যাপগুলো আমরা রিডিউস করতে পারি, স্পেশালি কর্পোরেট হাউস বা গভর্নমেন্টের সাথে সিভিওগুলোর যে কমিউনিকেশন গ্যাপ কীভাবে রিডিউস করা যায়, সেটা জানতে চাচ্ছি। ধন্যবাদ।
আপনাকে ধন্যবাদ। আমি কুইকলি আপনাকে যেগুলো আমার জানা আছে আমি বলি, যেগুলো আমি আজকে এখানে আলোচনায় অনেক কিছু আলোচনা হয়। একটা হলো যে ওই পাবলিক প্রাইভেট মডালিটি যেটা আছে, যে বেসরকারি খাতকে এগিয়ে আসতে হবে, সরকারি খাতের সাথে পাবলিক প্রাইভেট পার্টনারশিপ একটা করতে হবে। আরেকটা হলো যে প্রাইভেট সেক্টর ইনিশিয়েটিভ যেটা বলছি, আজকে ঢাকা চেম্বার এই কাজটা কেন করলো, টু ব্রেক দি আইস, যে ঠিক আছে ঢাকা চেম্বার এই কাজটা করলো। আমাদের যে একটা সুপার কনসোর্টিয়াম, যেখানে আপনারা জানেন যে অ্যাকশন এইড, ওয়ার্ল্ড ভিশন, ইউনাইটেড পারপাস এবং ইউরোপিয়ান ইউনিয়ন সহ আমরা সবাই, এবং ঢাকা চেম্বার ইজ দ্য প্রাইভেট সেক্টর ট্রেড অর্গানাইজেশন এবং একটা সুপরিচিত ট্রেড অর্গানাইজেশন। তো তারা এই কাজটা করলো টু শো যে দিস ইজ অলসো পার্ট অফ দ্য প্রাইভেট সেক্টর রেসপন্সিবিলিটি। এখন আমি আশাবাদী যে আমাদেরকে দেখে আজকে অন্যান্য অ্যাসোসিয়েশন আছে, অন্যান্য চেম্বার আছে, এই দেশে অনেকগুলো চেম্বার আছে, তারাও কিন্তু এখানে এগিয়ে আসতে পারে। এবং আমার এখন দায়িত্ব হবে আমাদের যে আমরা যে 4,500 পরিবারের যে আজকে চেম্বার, 4,500 এসএমইর যে চেম্বার, আমরা আমাদের প্রাইভেট সেক্টরে যারা আছে তাদেরকে আমরা এঙ্গেজ করব, যে আসেন আপনারা চলে আসেন এই যে ভলেন্টিয়ার হিসাবে এখানে। এছাড়া তারপরে আমাদের বিজনেস হাউস যেগুলো আছে, আমাদের মধ্যে শুধু এসএমই না, লার্জ কর্পোরেশনও আছে। লার্জ কর্পোরেশন আছে যারা 30,000 40,000 কর্মচারী এমপ্লয়মেন্ট জেনারেট করে, তাদের নিজস্ব অফিসে এই ধরনের একটা এমার্জেন্সি অপারেশন সেন্টার থাকা উচিত, যেটা আমাদের এনইওসি, ন্যাশনাল এমার্জেন্সি অপারেশন সেন্টার থাকা উচিত। আর এছাড়া কিছু প্রশ্ন আপনি করেছেন, আমি দেখেছি আজকে এখানে আমাদের প্রধান অতিথি একটা স্পিচ নিয়ে এসছেন, কিন্তু ওইগুলো সব কেটে উনি কিন্তু আপনাদের সবার কথা নোট করছে এখানে। তার মানে উনি আজকে স্পিচটা পড়বেন না, উনি আপনাদেরকে সরাসরি অ্যাড্রেস করবেন এখানে। আমি ইজ দেয়ার এনিবডি এলস, আর কোনো কি প্রশ্ন? জি বলেন।
সালামালাইকুম, আমি মোহাম্মদ জমশেদ আলী বলছিলাম। আমি মানে লুব্রিকেন্টস এবং কেমিক্যাল ইম্পোর্ট করি। আমার কোম্পানি এশিয়ান পেট্রোকেমিক্যালস লিমিটেড। যে আমি কথাগুলো বাংলায় বলতেছি। আমি সর্বপ্রথম ধন্যবাদ জানাচ্ছি ঢাকা চেম্বারকে, যারা সুন্দর একটা আজকে এই সেমিনার আয়োজন করার জন্য, এবং ধন্যবাদ জানাচ্ছি অল প্যানেলিস্টকে, যারা আজকে সুন্দর সুন্দর আমাদের মাঝে তারা তাদের মূল্যবান কথাগুলো আমাদের মাঝে আজকে তুলে ধরেছেন। তো আমি একটু কথা বলতে চাই যে দুর্যোগ ব্যবস্থাপনা, যেমন দেখা যাচ্ছে যে ফায়ার প্লাস আপনাদের ভূমিকম্প হয়, যেটা ভূমিকম্প হয় এবং যেখানে বাড়িঘরে আগুন লাগে, এবং একজন বললো যে রানা প্লাজা যে কারণে হয়েছে। তো আমি সর্বপ্রথম বলবো যে ওই আপনার দেখা যাচ্ছে যে এই কলকাতাতেই আমি বলি, আমাদের পাশের দেশ ইন্ডিয়া, কলকাতাতে কিন্তু অনেক পুরানো বিল্ডিং, অনেক আপনারা গেলে দেখতে পাবেন যে অনেক পুরানো বিল্ডিং কিন্তু তারা করে রাখছে, এগুলো কিন্তু এখন ভাঙতে পারে নাই। দেখা যাচ্ছে যে কেন ভাঙে না সেটা হয়তো আপনারা জানেন, যে ওইখানে রাস্তার কারণে দেখা যাচ্ছে এখন একটা বিল্ডিং 5 তলা ওইখানে হয়ে গেছে অলরেডি, আরও 20 বছর আগের করা, অনেক পুরোনো বিল্ডিং, দেখা যাচ্ছে 50 বছর আগের করা, কিন্তু এগুলো ভাঙতেছে না কেন জানেন? এটা ভাঙলে কিন্তু দেখা যাচ্ছে এটা 1 তলা বিল্ডিং হয়ে যাবে, কারণ তার এখন 5 তলা বিল্ডিং আছে, এটা ভাঙলে 1 তলা হয়ে যাবে, কারণ 2 তলা হয়ে যাবে। এর কারণ হলো ওইখানে দেখা যাচ্ছে যে একটা আইন আছে, একটা আইন বলতে যার বাড়ির সামনে রাস্তা 6 ফিট সে 1 তলা বিল্ডিং করতে পারবে, যার বাড়ির সামনে রাস্তা 10 ফিট সে 2 তলা করতে পারবে, এবং 20 ফিটের উপরে সে 3 তলা করতে পারবে। তো এটার কারণে কিন্তু তারা মানে এই আইনটা কিন্তু তাদের এখানে কলকাতায় অনেক ভালোভাবে এটা কিন্তু তারা মেনে চলে, কিন্তু আমাদের বাংলাদেশে এই আইনগুলো কিন্তু আমরা মানতেছি না। এই না মানার কারণে কিন্তু এই যে আগুন লাগলে, ভূমিকম্প হলে আমরা কিন্তু সাথে যেতে পারি না, এবং এটা কিন্তু আমরা মানে আমাদের যে ক্ষতিটা যদি আমরা তাড়াতাড়ি যেতে পারতাম, আমাদের কিন্তু ক্ষতিটা অনেক কম হতো, কিন্তু এর কারণে আমরা না যেতে পারার কারণে কিন্তু আমাদের অনেক ক্ষতিগ্রস্ত আমরা হচ্ছি। তো এই ব্যাপারে যদি আপনারা কোনো সুনির্দিষ্ট কোনো দিবেন যে আমাদের দেশে আইন আছে, এই আইনটা যদি আমরা মানতে পারি, তাহলে এটা মনে হয় আমাদের জন্য আরও অনেক বেটার পজিশন হবে। থ্যাংক ইউ, ধন্যবাদ। আসসালামু আলাইকুম।
আপনাকে অসংখ্য ধন্যবাদ। আপনি বেশ কয়েকটা গুরুত্বপূর্ণ কথা বলেছেন। আমি এই পর্যায়ে এইদিকে সামনের সারিতে চলে আসেন। আমি আর 2টো প্রশ্ন নিয়ে আমি শেষ করে দিব। আমাদের আপনি জানেন যে আজকে সমাপনী অনুষ্ঠান আছে বিকেল 4টার সময়। বল, মাইকটা অন করে দাও।
হ্যালো, জি আসসালামু আলাইকুম। ডিসিসিআই একটা বড় পরিবার। সো আমরা যারা এন্টারপ্রেনার হিসেবে ডিসিসিআই এর সাথে আছি, আমাদের পরিবারটাই অনেক বড়। আর এখানে প্রাইভেট সেক্টরের যারা এন্টারপ্রেনারশিপ এবং যারা একদম প্রডিউসার লেভেলে আছে বা যারা ইন্ডাস্ট্রি লেভেলে আছে, তাদের অনেক ধরনের ডিজাস্টার ম্যানেজমেন্ট করতে হয়। তো প্রাইভেট সেক্টরে এই ডিজাস্টার ম্যানেজমেন্টে তো আমাদের চেম্বার অ্যাসোসিয়েশনগুলো তো অটোমেটিক এগিয়ে আসবে, কিন্তু চেম্বারগুলোর পাশাপাশি যদি এ ধরনের এন্টারপ্রেনারদেরকে কী ধরনের ডিজাস্টার ম্যানেজমেন্টকে ফ্যাসিলিটি দেয়া যায়, এটার জন্য যদি হচ্ছে প্রাইম মিনিস্টার অফিসের সাথে আমাদের চেম্বারের সাথে একটা লিঙ্ক করে দেয়া যায়, এবং আমরা পরবর্তীতে যে ধরনের ডিজাস্টার ফেস করছে বিভিন্ন ধরনের এন্টারপ্রেনার, আপনারা জানেন হাওড়ে এবং সিলেটে এখন কিন্তু বন্যা হচ্ছে। সো ওখানে যারা এগ্রিকালচার বিজনেসের সাথে আছে তারা নানান ধরনের প্রবলেম ফেস করছে। তো এখন কিন্তু রিসার্চ বেসড আমাদের বেশ কিছু কাজ করা দরকার, যে কোথায় কখন কোন ধরনের ডিজাস্টারে আমাদের কি ধরনের ফ্যাসিলিটি দিতে হবে এবং সেই ফ্যাসিলিটিগুলো কিভাবে হবে, এবং যারা ইন্স্যুরেন্সের সাথে কাজ করছেন সেই ইন্স্যুরেন্সের কিন্তু আমাদের অ্যাগ্রো বেস বিজনেস বা যারা আমাদের ফার্মার লেভেলে আছে তাদের কিন্তু একেবারেই নলেজ নেই। তো সেই নলেজ বেসটা বাড়ানোর জন্য ইন্স্যুরেন্স অ্যাসোসিয়েশনকেও আরও বেশি এগিয়ে আসতে হবে ডিজাস্টার ম্যানেজমেন্টের জন্য। আর আমার লাস্ট পয়েন্ট হচ্ছে ফার্মার এবং ফিশারিজ নিয়ে যারা কাজ করছে, যারা সমুদ্রে অনেক কষ্ট করে বিভিন্ন সময় মাছ ধরে আমাদেরকে এই বিজনেসের সাথে ইনভলভ করছে। তো আমরা দেখছি যে আমরা তো অলরেডি ব্লু ইকোনমি নিয়ে কাজ করছি, কিন্তু এখানে ডিজাস্টার প্রায় সময় হয়ে থাকে সমুদ্রে। আমরা দেখি যে বিভিন্ন সময় কিন্তু ঝড়ের কবলে পড়ে। তো তাদের কাছে কিভাবে আগে থেকেই আমরা কোন উপায়ে আসলে এই ডিজাস্টার রোধ করার জন্য তাদেরকে ইনফরমেশন দিতে পারি, বা স্যাটেলাইটের মাধ্যমে বা তাদের হাতে কোনো প্রযুক্তি দিয়ে দিতে পারি কিনা, এরকম আমরা আগে থেকেই রিসার্চ বেস কিছু করতে পারি কিনা। আমার মনে হয় যে আমাদের ইনোভেটিভ সেন্টার আছে, যেখানে আমরা ঢাকা চেম্বার থেকে ইনোভেশন নিয়ে কাজ করছি। পাশাপাশি আমরা আমাদের যে এসএমই পরিবার যারা আছে, যারা এই ইন্ডাস্ট্রিগুলোর সাথে যুক্ত আছে, তাদের জন্য আমার মনে হয় যে এখন প্রাইভেট সেক্টর এবং পাবলিক সেক্টর মিলে তো আমরা গভর্নমেন্ট থেকেও কাজ করছি, প্রাইভেট সেক্টরও কাজ করছি। আমাদের এখন মনে হয় সময় এসছে যে সরাসরি আসলে এন্টারপ্রেনারদের নিডটা কি, ডিজাস্টার তাদের কি ধরনের হয় এবং তাদেরকে কি
কাম ফার্স্ট, এবং ইঞ্জিনিয়ারিং ফার্মগুলোর একটু এগিয়ে আসা উচিত। থ্যাংক ইউ।
We have the guest of honor of our next session, the closing session. Interestingly, he is the chair of the task force of disaster and climate risk reduction of the UNESCAP. আমি ব্রিফলি ওনার থেকে আমরা একটু মানে ফর সেলফিশ রিজনস, ফর আওয়ার লার্নিং পারপাসেস আমরা ওনার কাছে শুনতে চাইব রিগার্ডিং হাউ দি UNESCAP has been, because the UNESCAP is the social commission for the Asia and the Pacific. So APEC regione এগুলো নিয়ে কী কী কাজ করছেন এবং হাউ বাংলাদেশ ক্যান বি created as an example in the future for disaster risk